Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Mark Frazier. I'm a co-academic director of the India-China Institute and also here in the Department of Politics at the New School. It's my great honor tonight to introduce to you Professor Elizabeth Perry, who is known to many of you as a leading authority for her highly insightful and innovative work on modern China and the politics of modern China. And here by modern, I mean as they do in the Chinese context, 19th and 20th century China as well as the 21st. I also know her as an incredibly generous and supportive academic mentor who has trained a very long line of scholars who've, in different ways, undertaken the study of China and have done so using historically and culturally grounded approaches that can be quite rare to find, especially in a field that looks the way the field of political science does these days. I wanted to share with you one remembrance that I had as a graduate student at the University of Washington many years ago, where I first took graduate courses with Liz. I remember going to her office one day and asking for a little bit of guidance on a research topic that would be the second of two MA seminar-like papers that were needed for the MA degree. And she mentioned to me that she had this long-standing interest in this coal mining region of China known as Anyuan. And the library at the University of Washington had a little bit of solid amount of Chinese language sources, which I would be using for the first time, Chinese materials, in my research. And I remember producing a passable paper anyway on secret society lodges in the area and the coal miners and the strike in 1922. But many years later, I heard by email from Liz that she was headed off to Anyuan to do field work. And I was very excited to hear this because I knew that it would eventually result in a book of the kind that so many of us have come to know as her work, which is heavily based in archival and documentary sources, focuses on or illuminates the politics that involve human agency and historical contingency, that have rich conceptual frameworks that are also brought to bear. She has done this again with the book that we'll be talking about tonight, Anyuan. I wanted to point out to you, those of you who have not yet purchased it and read it, that we have flyers over here at the table available for your picking up afterwards, in which you can get a 20% discount from the University of California Press, which is, as I understand it from the author, is about the going rate for what an author gets on her own books from UC Press. I'm not going to read the bio that came with the promotion materials and posters. You can do that yourself. But I will note that she is the Henry Rosofsky Professor of Government at Harvard and director of the Harvard Yenjing Institute. She is a past president of the Association for Asian Studies, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. Something that's not in her official bio, I think, is that her undergraduate alma mater, Hobart and William Smith colleges, some years ago, I remember being contacted by the provost of the college to tell me that they were going to honor her, and they have honored her, by naming the Asian Studies Library at the college after her. So it was a few weeks ago that I, through interlibrary loan, neither the New School nor the NYU's library had this book, but I was very happy when I picked up the book at the Bobst Library desk and saw on the spine that this was from the Perry Library from Hobart and William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York, and I was delighted to see that. After Professor Perry's lecture, my colleague in the Department of Politics, Jessica Pisano, will offer her reactions and comments and insights on tonight's lecture. I'm delighted to have Jessica joining us this evening. She is, as many of you know, a specialist on Russian and Ukrainian and East European politics and history, has, like Professor Perry, spent many years doing field work in the places of her interest. In this case, her book is on the politics of property relations in borderlands of Ukraine and Russia and the effects of privatization. I invited her comments tonight as a specialist on Russia because I'm sure we will have a very rewarding interchange as we think about the legacies of the Chinese Revolution and of the Russian Revolution and the similarities and differences in between. Following that, we will take your questions from the floor. So please now join me in welcoming to the New School Professor Elizabeth Perry.
Thank you so much. As Mark mentioned, we've known each other for a very long time, both at the University of Washington in Seattle and also at the University of California in Berkeley. And it's a wonderful pleasure to see him here in New York. Can all of you hear me fine? Okay, good. The title of my talk today is The Cultural Foundations of Chinese Communism, and as Mark mentioned, I'll be drawing from my recently published book entitled Anyuan, Mining China's Revolutionary Tradition. Now, the idea of a revolutionary tradition is itself inherently ironic. Revolutions, after all, are supposed to be about overthrowing traditions, not about enshrining them. But countries that are born of revolution construct myths about their origins that prove as persistent as they are contested. If we think about the rise of the Tea Party movement in the United States, named, of course, for the incident in Boston Harbor that helped to ignite the American Revolution, that Tea Party movement has, of course, highlighted divisions in interpretations of America's revolutionary inheritance. And these debates not only change our narratives about the past, they also affect our understandings of the present and future political possibilities. In no country of the world is the challenge of confronting the revolutionary past in order to chart a new political future more challenging, less predictable than China. There are no obvious precedents that allow us to forecast with any degree of confidence the fate of the Chinese communist system. In contrast to an earlier era when it looked as though Chinese and Russian communism had been cut from the same revolutionary cloth and were headed down a shared historical trajectory, these days the differences between China and Russia could hardly seem more stark. Perry Anderson has written in a recent piece, quote, "If the 20th century was dominated by the trajectory of the Russian Revolution, the 21st century will be shaped by the outcome of the Chinese Revolution. The Soviet state dissolved after 7 decades with scarcely a shot. The outcome of the Chinese Revolution offers an arresting contrast. As it enters its 7th decade, the People's Republic is an engine of the world economy. Of the difference between the fate of the revolutions in China and Russia, there can be little doubt," unquote. Now, Anderson is writing at a time when the collapse of the Soviet Union more than 20 years ago has already relegated the Russian Revolution to something of a distant memory for most of us, while on the other hand, China's stunning economic ascendance, engineered by a communist party that continues to celebrate its revolutionary origins, has focused renewed attention on the legacies of the Chinese Revolution. The paramount leader of that revolution, Mao, passed away many decades ago, more than 3 decades ago now, and yet his picture still hangs in the place of highest political order atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace, Tiananmen, in the center of Beijing. Mao Zedong thought continues to be recognized as a centerpiece of the ideology of the PRC. There you see on the 60th anniversary, a big float carrying Mao in the background there, and in the front, long live Mao Zedong thought. Mao's mausoleum, located just across Tiananmen Square, continues to draw a steady stream of visitors. And the fascination with Mao isn't limited to the capital of Beijing. Until fairly recently, 900 miles inland in China's largest city of Chongqing, there was a massive Singing Red campaign to revive Maoist revolutionary culture, squashed when Bo Xilai was squashed, but nonetheless, I think, important. Reverence for Mao extends well beyond these state-sponsored initiatives. A survey of popular religious beliefs that recently was conducted in 40 major Chinese cities found that nearly 12% of urban residents report regularly worshiping images of Chairman Mao in their own homes. About the same number who say they venerate ancestor tablets, and more than the 10% who say they pray to Buddhist images, although there's not necessarily any contradiction. If you look up there in the upper left-hand corner of the picture of Mao, you see a little picture of the Bodhisattva, the Guanyin Pusa, so you can worship the goddess of mercy at the same time that you worship Chairman Mao. The exact influence of Maoism on contemporary Chinese politics certainly is open to debate. For an argument that it remains very important, you can see a volume that I co-edited with a German political scientist in which we argue that Mao's, what we call his guerrilla policy style, continues to influence policymaking in contemporary China. But whether you buy our argument in that volume or not, I think, as Perry Anderson points out, the importance of Mao's revolution in giving rise to a vibrant, unified country that today is a dynamo of the global economy does seem undeniable. So what explains the distinctive trajectory of the Chinese Revolution? How and why did it diverge from its Russian prototype? And what meanings does that Chinese revolutionary tradition hold for Chinese citizens today? Recent work by Western writers paints a very dark picture of Mao and his brand of revolutionary change. From his earliest days as a political organizer, Mao's best-selling biographers tell us in this book, The Unknown Story of Mao, the man was a vile and a ruthless individual whose cynical machinations would bring terrible, needless hardship to most of his countrymen. In a more recent volume written by Alexander Pansov, the Russian historian of China, using Soviet archives, although he calls this Mao the real story and poses it against the earlier so-called unknown story. In fact, it's a pretty similar story. And in these books, we learn that the poorest, the most vulnerable members of Chinese society, the very people in whose name Mao waged revolution, would suffer more than anyone from his eccentric follies. There's plenty of evidence to support this grim conclusion. And yet, that being the case, how then do we explain Mao's remarkable ability to convince millions of his fellow countrymen to sacrifice for his revolution long before he had the coercive means to enforce compliance? And how do we account for the outpouring of nostalgia toward Mao and his accomplishments, so evident among ordinary Chinese and especially among the most disadvantaged of them, even today, more than 30 years after his death? There at Mao's native place of Shaoshan, you see worshipers burning paper money and incense and sending up their prayers of hope to the chairman. Mao's charismatic appeal then and now is part of a larger revolutionary tradition that continues to reverberate in significant and sometimes quite surprising ways. In contrast to Lenin's revolution, Mao's revolution was a protracted process. The Chinese Communist Revolution took nearly 30 years to complete, to achieve political victory, from the establishment of a party in 1921 to the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949. It began, like its Russian exemplar, as a movement based in the cities, directed toward the urban proletariat. But the Chinese Communist Revolution was soon forced out of the cities into the countryside, where under Mao's leadership, it grew into a powerful peasant army capable of fighting first the Japanese and then the nationalists. But military victory didn't mark the end of the revolutionary process. Mao's call to continue the revolution found expression in a series of tumultuous mass campaigns that stretched from land reform in the early 1950s through the Cultural Revolution decade of 1966 to 76. Mao's lifelong attempt to invent and to instill a continuing revolutionary culture was still incomplete at the time of his death in 1976, but it left, I would argue, a searing impact. Despite the peasant demeanor of Mao and his colleagues, the early leaders of the Communist Party were, for the most part, educated intellectuals who brought to their organizing a substantial amount of cultural capital and cultural creativity. And central to their mobilization effort, I argue, is the role of cultural positioning, or the deployment of a range of symbolic resources: religion, ritual, rhetoric, dress, drama, art, and so forth, for the purposes of political persuasion. The supple methods of Mao and his comrades not only enabled the transplantation of Soviet ideas and institutions onto Chinese soil, but it also ensured that the Chinese revolutionary variant would grow into something rather different from its Russian prototype. After the establishment of the PRC, cultural positioning was superseded by cultural patronage, which took full advantage of the state's propaganda apparatus to rework the revolutionary tradition in ways that were intended to strengthen state legitimacy by elevating the authority of the party and the political elite. And both cultural positioning in making the revolutionary tradition and cultural patronage in mining that revolutionary tradition helped to make what was, in fact, a fundamentally new communist order come to seem familiarly Chinese. So this is really the point that I try to puzzle over in this book. How is it that such a foreign revolution with such foreign ideas, such foreign institutions that were imported from the Soviet Union has come over time to seem to many Chinese people as an institution, as a political system that is quintessentially Chinese? Now, to stress the importance of cultural positioning and patronage in generating a Chinese species of communism is definitely not to suggest some essential continuity from imperial days to the present that preordained any particular or predictable outcome. Culture, as we know, is a realm of constantly changing, often seemingly contradictory semiotic practices. But this isn't to say that culture is either arbitrary or infinitely malleable. Effective cultural positioning and cultural patronage require intimate familiarity with prevailing norms and also a keen eye for the possibility of meaningful invention within tradition. And some revolutions and some revolutionary leaders are better at this than others. Let me try now to provide some evidence for these claims from my book on Anyuan. Anyuan, as Mark mentioned, is the site of a large coal mine that's located in the heartland of China amidst the beautiful mountain scenery. It was established at the end of the 19th century as part of the self-strengthening movement of the late Qing dynasty with German technological know-how. It's located amidst this beautiful mountain scenery of Jiangxi province. In the square there, you'll see a blow-up in this next map. Pingxiang is the county, now a municipality, in which the Anyuan coal mine is located, right there on the provincial border between Hunan province to the west and Jiangxi province to the east. It's administratively, territorially within Jiangxi province, but culturally really very much part of Hunan. And the vast majority of the coal miners came from two counties, Liling County, which is just right next door there in Hunan, from which one of the early communist leaders, Li Lisan, came. And a little bit there to the further northwest, you see Xiangtan, which was Mao Zedong's home county. Anyuan was, and if you looked at the map, also south, just south and up the mountains is Jinggangshan, the first rural base area of the communists, where Mao built his first rural base and where he began to recruit a Red Army. So all of these are very close together. Anyuan was the scene of one of the most celebrated events in early Communist Party history, a strike in 1922 that was instigated by Mao, among others, and that won major gains for the workers. This is a picture I took not long ago at the Anyuan coal mine. This is the main old entrance to the mine where Mao and the other early communist leaders went underground to mobilize the workers. Coal is still brought out, still an active working coal mine. To the right there, you see what is now an empty little building, but back at the time when Mao was there in the 1920s, that little building was filled with images of the Bodhisattva images to which the miners would burn incense and bow each morning before they went in to engage in their extremely dangerous work. For 3 years after the 1922 strike, Anyuan was the most active center of communist labor organizing in China. Its communist-sponsored schools produced thousands of literate workers who went on to play a very important role in the revolution. The Anyuan experiment ended in 1925 with brutal warlord suppression, but its legacy lived on through the key contributions of Anyuan workers to the Autumn Harvest Uprising, which marked the beginning of rural revolution and the development of a Red Army. And Anyuan workers became leaders of the famous Hunan peasant associations that Mao would later champion. They served as political commissars and officers in the army. And so it's hardly surprising that after 1949, the history of Anyuan would find an important place in the construction of a revolutionary tradition. But in this invented tradition, the role of the workers would be largely eclipsed, indeed, for the most part, erased in favor of an exaggerated image of some of their leaders. Now, three important early leaders of the Communist Party were active at Anyuan in the 1920s. This is a movie version depicting them. There on the left, you see Mao Zedong dressed in his Chinese robes. He was educated only in China. In the middle, you see Li Lisan dressed in his coat and tie. He was just back from education in France. And on the end there, Liu Shaoqi, who had just returned from 2 years in the Soviet Union wearing his Soviet cadre outfit. All three of these men hailed from Hunan. And today, if you visit Anyuan, have any of you actually visited Anyuan? No? Oh, well, please go. They'll be delighted to take your tourist dollars. They're now a stop on the red tourist pilgrimage route of Jiangxi province. Anyway, if you go there, you can see statues of these three individuals, and the size of these statues gives you some indication of their stature in contemporary Chinese official party historiography. So there's a towering statue of Mao Zedong in front of a museum to the labor movement. There's a 3/4 size statue of Liu Shaoqi, and poor old Li Lisan is left with a little bust. This is the exact opposite of what I believe to be their actual contributions to the Anyuan revolutionary tradition. All three of these men hailed from Hunan province. Mao and Li Lisan in particular came from nearby counties from which the coal miners themselves had come. As cultural insiders, they were capable of talking to the miners in their own Hunan dialect on the basis of shared idiomatic understandings. Mao initially visited Anyuan as part of an effort by the newly founded Communist Party to target industrial sites for proletarian uprising. This, of course, was the classic Russian recipe for revolution. But winning over the more than 10,000 illiterate coal miners at Anyuan, most of whom were hardened members of the Triad secret society, would require some doing. And Mao entrusted this challenge of mobilizing the workers to Li Lisan. Mao himself remained across the border in Changsha, working as a teacher by day and directing the Communist Labor Secretariat by night. And he sent Li Lisan, who had just returned from his studies in France and just joined the Communist Party. Li Lisan, whose native county was located just across the border from Anyuan there in Hunan in the county of Liling, recommending that Li Lisan present himself at Anyuan as an aspiring school teacher, after which he should proceed to organize a labor union and then a Communist Party branch in preparation for a strike. Again, this was a Russian recipe, but it would be carried out in a distinctively Chinese style. Li Lisan, like Mao before him, arrived at Anyuan wearing the full-length Confucian scholar's gown that signaled his status as a member of the intellectual elite. This is a picture taken a few years later of the communist school teachers at Anyuan. You see most of them wearing their Mandarin gowns. Li Lisan quickly put his calligraphy brush to good use to compose in his beautiful classical Chinese. His father was a Confucian degree holder, and Li Lisan himself had taught the Confucian classics before going to France. And so he composed for the conservative county magistrate there in Pingxiang an erudite essay about his pedagogical aims that favorably impressed the magistrate. And with the magistrate's encouragement, Li Lisan was able to open a night school for workers and then a union that he euphemistically called a workers' club or a gongren julebu. The success of the Anyuan mobilization effort was closely related to the ability of these young communist cadres to convert cultural capital into valuable revolutionary currency. And Li Lisan was especially gifted at this task. Li's efforts at cultural positioning drew upon a broad range of familiar practices that included not only Mandarin dress and calligraphy, but also folk religion and even secret society conventions. To stir up interest in his new workers' club, Li decided that his night school should host a lion dance at the time of the annual Lantern Festival. In this region of China, the Lantern Festival was a time when the local elite would sponsor exhibitions by martial arts masters who would display their skills and thereby attract new disciples. This is also one of the two major fireworks producing areas in China, and so these lion dance lantern festivals were very loud, raucous occasions. In fact, to anyone doing field work in Anyuan today, it's a constant struggle to get any sleep because you hear fireworks are going off constantly throughout the night. But in any case, on this occasion, one of Li Lisan's new recruits to his workers' club, who was a low-level triad chieftain with martial arts skills second to none, donned a resplendent lion's costume of this sort, and to the accompaniment of firecrackers, gamely pranced through the town of Anyuan. As intended, his performance attracted a very large crowd, which followed this lively dancer back to the workers' club to try to find out how to enlist as his disciples. But contrary to popular expectation, the lion dancer announced to the crowd, quote, "My teacher's home is in Liling," so this was Li Lisan's native county, "but the ancestral founder, the Shigong of our school, lives far, far away. To find him, one must cross the 7 seas. He's now more than 100 years old, and his name is Teacher Ma Tianshi, a bearded grandpa, 大胡子老公公, Karl Marx." So here was this secret society member describing the ancestral teacher of their religion, Teacher Ma, in familiar terms as a bearded grandpa living across the seas. Li Lisan's imaginative recruitment tactics resulted in a massive influx of new members. But his festivities didn't end there. On May Day of 1922, the Workers' Club at Anyuan was inaugurated with a gala parade in which once again Li's ingenuity in reworking old practices for new purposes was on brilliant display. On this May Day, his followers carried an open palanquin of the sort that usually was used to carry deities through the streets during religious festivals, temple festivals. But on this May Day, the honored passenger riding inside the palanquin was a statue of that bearded grandpa from across the seven seas, Karl Marx. And if you visit Anyuan and you visit the Anyuan Labor Museum, you can see this statue of Karl Marx that was paraded through the streets like a traditional deity. Li Lisan's innovative cultural positioning was converting very familiar folk religions, religious rituals, into vehicles for revolutionary recruitment. Meanwhile, Mao, after another visit to Anyuan, concluded that thanks to Li Lisan's 9 months of inspired efforts, conditions were ripe for a strike. Mao cautioned that this strike should be a nonviolent strike intended to win the public sympathy of the elite for the plight of the workers. And following Mao's advice, Li Lisan came up with a stirring slogan for the strike, once beasts of burden, now we will be human. 从前是牛马，现在要做人. This kind of cri de coeur was framed not in terms of class struggle. It was framed instead as a plea for human dignity of the sort that had animated peasant rebellions in this area for centuries. Aware that the triad secret society was the key to preventing bloodshed in the strike, Li Lisan also decided to make a direct appeal to the commander of the local triad secret society chapter. On a night when Li Lisan knew that the secret society was planning an initiation rite, he went to the lodge carrying a rooster and a bottle of liquor, which were the basic elements of a triad initiation ceremony. And many years later, Li Lisan would recall the signal importance of his mission to the triads, pointing out that he had won the support of the commander of the triads by framing his request in language that was congruent with secret society norms, stressing concepts such as honor, mutual assistance, helping the poor, and so forth. Once the triad commander agreed to support the strike, it began. And the 5-day nonviolent strike of some 13,000 Anyuan coal miners and railway workers, presented as a moving plea for human dignity, won the participation of the entire workforce. It also won the sympathy of key members of the local elite. The result was a stunning victory that was secured without property damage or personal injury, and that brought major improvements in workers' wages and labor conditions. Only 2 days before the strike was called, Mao had sent another of his fellow Hunanese, Liu Shaoqi, to Anyuan to help guide the strike. Now, Liu, as I mentioned, had just returned from his studies in the Soviet Union, and he was already known for possessing a kind of Leninist discipline that Mao figured would be a useful check on the charismatic Li Lisan. Although Li left Anyuan a few weeks after the strike, Liu Shaoqi remained at Anyuan for the next 3 years, and under his direction, Anyuan became known as China's Little Moscow, an experiment to replicate Soviet patterns in the heartland of China. One of Liu Shaoqi's accomplishments at Anyuan was the construction of a new workers' club, a much grander building to house the workers' club that Li Lisan had founded. And Liu Shaoqi proudly claimed that the architectural design for his new workers' club was modeled on that of the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow. You tell me, I don't know. Anyway, this was his claim. In contrast to Li Lisan, who had creatively and unapologetically made use of many indigenous customs, although he didn't restrict himself only to indigenous customs, but Liu Shaoqi had a marked preference for Russian ways that didn't always appeal to the workers of Anyuan. Liu Shaoqi, I would argue, was not nearly as gifted at cultural positioning, and he certainly was not nearly as popular with the miners as his predecessor had been, But still, he could boast of some lasting accomplishments at Anyuan during his 3 years there, including a quantum leap in literacy and political awareness among the workers who had studied at the 7 communist schools that sprung up in Anyuan and its surrounding area. More than 5,000 Anyuan workers were educated at these schools. They later joined the Red Army in droves. Many of them became political officers. But after the establishment of the People's Republic of China, when the Anyuan revolutionary tradition became an important subject of state-sponsored patronage, the focus of this propaganda effort was not on the thousands of workers who had played such a central role in the revolution, but rather on their leaders, and not even on the leader toward whom the workers harbored the greatest sentiment, the greatest fondness. Li Li-san was conveniently forgotten by the party state shortly after the establishment of the PRC. He was brought back to China first from 15 years in exile. He had been sent off to the Soviet Union in ignominy. He was brought back when it was realized that the communists were suddenly going to take over the cities of China, and Li Li-san had the knowledge of how to do that. But very soon into the new PRC, Li Li-san was removed of his posts as first Minister of Labor of the PRC and head of the trade unions on grounds of championing workers' rights at the expense of Communist Party control. By contrast, the role of Liu Shaoqi in reconstructions of Anyuan was quite striking in the late 1950s and early 1960s. At this time, Liu Shaoqi was vice chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, second in command only to Mao, and was well known as Mao's putative successor following the terrible famine of the Great Leap in 1958. At this time, children's stories about Liu Shaoqi's supposed superhuman bravery during the Anyuan strike of 1922 became required reading in elementary school texts. Visual arts were used to embellish Liu Shaoqi's Anyuan experience. In 1962, a large oil painting entitled Comrade Liu Shaoqi and the Anyuan Workers was produced for display in the newly opened Museum of the Revolution in Tiananmen Square. The painting was part of a cult of personality that was developing around Liu Shaoqi at this time, which I think was modeled on Stalin's earlier cult of personality. This famous poster of Stalin and the miners, which, as Vicky Bonnell points out, was a central icon in the Stalinist cult of personality. Between 1962 and 65, during the height of Liu Shaoqi's political ascendance, several 100,000 copies of this painting were in circulation. Widely recognized as it was, this painting's popularity paled before another visual image of Liu at Anyuan. A movie entitled Prairie Fire, or Liaoyuan, opened in 1962 to packed theaters around China. And this movie, whose production was very closely overseen by the Ministry of Culture, depicted Liu Shaoqi as the sole protagonist of the Anyuan labor movement. The film afforded no role for either Li Li-san or Mao Zedong. And in this period, in the late 50s and early 60s, every communist achievement of the 1920s at Anyuan was being credited to solely one individual, Liu Shaoqi, Mao's putative successor. But very soon, that would all change. In 1966, Mao launched his great proletarian cultural revolution. It was intended to cultivate revolutionary successors, the so-called Red Guards, by giving young people a taste of the revolutionary experiences that the aging generation had endured in its own struggle for power. And this new mass campaign was intended to prevent Soviet-style revisionism by promoting China's authentic proletarian culture. Now Liu Shaoqi was attacked as China's Khrushchev. He was charged with having committed counter-revolutionary crimes dating back to his days at Anyuan, when Anyuan was known as China's Little Moscow. The products of cultural patronage that earlier had been sponsored by the boosters of Liu Shaoqi were now condemned as incriminating evidence of Soviet revisionism. The oil painting of Liu Shaoqi and the workers of Anyuan that I think had been inspired by this poster of Stalin and the coal miners now was deemed the earliest evidence in the field of literature and art of Liu Shaoqi's attempt to tamper with party history. That painting was unceremoniously removed from the Museum of the Revolution to make way for a major new Cultural Revolution exhibit that was entitled "The Brilliance of Mao Zedong Thought Illuminates the Anyuan Labor Movement." So here you have a catalog of this new exhibit at the Museum of the Revolution. The catalog is entitled "From Anyuan to Jinggangshan." Here you see Mao and the new Red Army standing atop his base area in Jinggangshan. In the background there, you see the Anyuan coal mine and these miners streaming out of the coal mine to join Chairman Mao in rural revolution. Among the many artworks in this new exhibit, one stood out for its simplicity and its grandeur. And that was the painting entitled "Chairman Mao Goes to Anyuan, Mao Zhuxi去Anyuan," painted by Liu Chunhua in 1967. The painting purports to depict Mao's maiden trip to the coal mine in the fall of 1921, and it presents a stirring image of the young revolutionary. There he is standing majestically amidst the scenic mountains, clad in his long scholar's gown, holding a simple Hunan oiled paper umbrella. Mao here is portrayed in romantic, even religious tones. And after the Cultural Revolution, in interviews with American art historians, the painter, Liu Chunhua, admitted that his inspiration for this painting, which was the first oil painting he had ever completed, came in part from German Romanticism and in part from the religious paintings of Raphael. Now, the possibility of this painting serving as a central pillar in the growing cult of personality surrounding Chairman Mao wasn't lost on Mao's wife, Jiang Qing. When she first saw a photograph of this painting, she concluded that it was an ideal model for veneration and emulation. And on July 1st of 1968, the front pages of all the major newspapers and journals were devoted to full-spread color reproductions of the painting. Soon, the likeness appeared on posters. It appeared on Mao buttons, Mao badges. It appeared on plates, vases, pottery. It's a particularly attractive one. Cigarette cases, embroidery, and many other media. The most common postage stamp, with a run of 50 million during the Cultural Revolution, was the 8-cent likeness of Chairman Mao on his way to Anyuan. It was also the only stamp exempt from postal cancellation to avoid desecrating its sacred image. Copies of this painting were reverently received as an object of veneration, not only at Anyuan itself, but in urban neighborhoods, in factories. There in the background there, you can see a copy of the painting being received in a Shanghai factory. It was received on military barracks. Here are soldiers holding up the double happiness sign, usually reserved for weddings, but they're feeling as happy as a wedding to be receiving copies of Chairman Mao's painting here. Down in the countryside, in communes, revolutionary swim meets. Here Mao as a Red Army soldier in the front, but Mao going to Anyuan in the background there. Group photographs of people exchanging revolutionary experiences. And when Red Guards were demobilized and sent up to the mountains and down to the countryside, they were often inspired by this painting. This is said to be the most reproduced painting in all of history, with some 900 million copies in circulation at one time. The appeal of Liu Chunhua's painting extended beyond the borders of China. In fact, so sublime was this image of the young Mao's arrival at Anyuan that one reproduction by an Italian artist even hung in the halls of the Vatican in Rome for several months above a caption that said, "Young Chinese missionary," until its true provenance was discovered and this beatific likeness of Chairman Mao was hastily removed. The Vatican, I think, was instinctively onto something. They may not have known it was Chairman Mao, but the Cultural Revolution was, I believe, among many other things, a kind of religious revival that sought to rescue Mao's true faith from the sinful path of Soviet revisionism that Liu Shaoqi had allegedly attempted to pursue. Correcting history then required an even more deified image of Mao than the one previously developed for a comrade Liu. As the painter explained, quote, "We placed Chairman Mao in the forefront of the painting, advancing toward us like a rising sun, bringing hope to the people. In our mind, we were living in Anyuan during the 1920s, seeing with our own eyes the miserable plight of the miners, hearing their cries for the early arrival of their great savior," unquote. For a painter claiming to have channeled the yearnings of the downtrodden Anyuan miners, it's striking that no workers at all appear in this painting. But of course, in many ways, the Cultural Revolution, despite its title, The Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, was much less about the proletariat than it was about their purported savior, Chairman Mao. And on the same day that this painting was plastered across the front pages of all the major newspapers, thousands of people gathered at Anyuan to conduct a groundbreaking ceremony for a new memorial hall that would be the grandest of the many museums built during the Cultural Revolution to honor Mao's revolutionary achievements. The groundbreaking ceremony welcomed to Anyuan. Here's the museum that was built, opened in 1968, and you see the likeness of Chairman Mao's face taken from that famous Chairman Mao Goes to Anyuan painting put there on top of the museum. The groundbreaking ceremony for this museum welcomed to Anyuan a gigantic replica of the original oil painting, and the convocation had the distinct air of a religious festival. You could see the new museum being built up there on the top. It's then going to tower over Liu Shaoqi's old Bolshoi Theater down here below it. The convocation had a kind of religious flavor to it. This painting first was received by an artillery brigade that was stationed at the coal mine, singing "Sailing the Seas Depends Upon the Great Helmsman" to the accompaniment of drums, cymbals, firecrackers. The soldiers transported the painting to a place of honor. Miners poured out of the coal mining pits, having been alerted to the arrival of this painting by the Mao Thought propaganda team at the coal mine, which, not unlike the lion dancers of pre-49 China, had danced through the streets of Anyuan with their loyalty dances. Workers poured out then to participate. And to conclude this groundbreaking ceremony, the head of the Anyuan Revolutionary Committee intoned a loyalty oath to Mao on behalf of the Anyuan workforce that read like a kind of hybrid between a triad pledge and a Catholic creed. It went in very small part, quote, "Chairman Mao, we Anyuan miners are forever loyal to you, forever loyal to your brilliant thought, forever loyal to your revolutionary line. Seas may dry up and boulders turn to pebbles, but our red, red hearts loyal to you will never change. Heads may be smashed, blood may flow, but your brilliant thought will never be lost. We live to fight for your revolutionary line. We die to sacrifice for your revolutionary line. Chairman Mao, we will always remember your great teaching. Carry forth the Anyuan revolutionary tradition. Strive for greater glory," unquote. The searing impact of the Cultural Revolution, which in its imagery and rituals evidenced a syncretistic blend of religious practices, swept the entire country. And like other religious revivals, its impact would persist well after the death of the Messianic prophet. In the post-Mao period, the famous painting, Chairman Mao Goes to Anyuan, has continued to serve as a kind of lightning rod for interpretations of Mao and his revolution. Soon after the Cultural Revolution, the painting drew criticism. In 1979, the cartoonist Ye Qianyu emerged from a decade in prison with an article in People's Daily in which he highlighted the religious connotations of this painting. As Ye wrote, quote, "Experts who saw this painting all remarked that in its conception, design, even its use of color, it was slavishly indebted to the religious paintings of the Italian Renaissance. The Gang of Four declared this painting to be a model artistic product, ordering its massive reproduction so that it would hang in every hall and auditorium, every public, every private residence," unquote. But soon this negative criticism would give way to a different interpretation. 10 years later, in response to the Tiananmen uprising of 1989, the image of Mao was deliberately resuscitated via a state-sponsored cultural patronage effort designed to strengthen Chinese nationalism by remembering the revolution. The patriotic education campaign of the 1990s, followed by the Red Tourism campaign of the last several years, revived the romantic, religious image of Mao that had infused the Cultural Revolution. And the likeness of Mao on his way to Anyuan began to regain popular currency, and artists began to redraw this iconic image in a variety of arresting and sometimes amusing ways that indicated the continuing controversy that surrounds the meaning of China's revolutionary tradition. In 1991, for example, the artist Liu Dahong produced a work that he called Spring. Here you see the young Mao still wearing his long scholar's gown, but now with a halo over his head and a magical beam. It's a little hard to see it, but there's a magical beam emanating from his hand there. He's laid down his umbrella and instead has this magical light, which he's shining on these figures drawn from Buddhist mythology. So there is Mao with the red sun now rising behind his head, delivering a kind of Buddhist equivalent of the Sermon on the Mount. So this clearly underscores the religious dimensions of the original work, but in time, the repainting of this Anyuan image came to reflect other meanings as well. In 1995, the original painting, Chairman Mao Goes to Anyuan, was auctioned off to the Bank of Construction for a phenomenal 5.5 million yuan. And that same year, the avant-garde artist Wang Xingwei came up with a painting that he entitled The Way to the East, where you see a more commercialized view of Mao. Here's Mao dressed no longer in his Chinese scholar's gown, but instead in a Western business attire, carrying a Western umbrella in place of his traditional Hunan umbrella, and marching away from Anyuan, away from the coal miners. More recently, artists have injected a note of irony by adding or subtracting figures to the original archetype. In 2000, Wang Xingwei, again, with a piece that he entitled X-Ray. Here you see the young and the old Mao meeting on top of Anyuan with a crumpled body, perhaps the body of the revolution, falling between them. A painting by Yin Zhaoyang in 2005, entitled, again, Chairman Mao Goes to Anyuan, inserts onto a kind of blurry rendering of the familiar mountainscape a young worker waving at Mao, but we don't know whether he's waving at Mao to come back and to save the workers or whether he's happily bidding him farewell. Another painting, also entitled Chairman Mao Goes to Anyuan. Here you have the Anyuan landscape in brilliant clarity, but Chairman Mao, of course, has disappeared from the scene. The Chinese landscape remains beautiful and enduring, but perhaps the revolution not so much. A 2007 painting by Ma Baozhong, also entitled Chairman Mao Goes to Anyuan. So there you have a shadowy rendition of Chairman Mao welcoming to Anyuan an earlier practitioner of the cult of personality, Joseph Stalin, who now is garbed in a Chinese Mandarin robe himself. Communism finally has become Chinese. that the image of Mao on his way to Anyuan remains a source of political critique in contemporary China can be seen in some recent renditions that use digital technology. This one by Wang Tong, a photographer of shows the sprawling Anyuan district government offices in the background there that put the US Capitol to shame, actually, and that are viewed by locals as a symbol of official extravagance. Or this one entitled Chen Yunhui petitioning. Some of you may know Chen Yunhui was the local official in Zhejiang province who lost his life a couple of years ago after petitioning on behalf of villagers who had lost their lands to unscrupulous real estate deals. Chen Yunhui was run over by a red truck that many believed had been sent by the Public Security Bureau. So here he is standing in Chairman Mao's spot on Anyuan with the Public Security Bureau about to overtake him. Avant-garde art obviously is open to multiple interpretations. That's the whole point. But if you visit Anyuan itself, you will discover that most miners, like lots of poor people across China, express unabashed admiration for Mao. Here's a statue that was installed on the 80th anniversary of the strike, where workers often today burn joss sticks and pray to Chairman Mao. Mao is often spoken of in quasi-religious terms. As one Anyuan miner put it, quote, "The Bodhisattva protects good-hearted people. It's just like it says in quotations from Chairman Mao, evil is repaid with evil, good is repaid with good. It's all just the same thing," unquote. Religious beliefs and rituals were meaningful elements of people's lives long before the Communist Revolution. Miners burnt joss sticks to images of the Bodhisattva before they entered the coal mines each day. Much of Li Lisan's success in mobilizing the miners lay in his appropriation of popular religious practices. The Cult of Mao, that developed under state patronage during the Cultural Revolution, a central ritual of which was praying to the painting of the young Mao arriving at Anyuan, continued and escalated this process. And today, the grafting of reverence for Mao onto pre-communist religious customs provides an extra layer of spiritual protection for those who are anxious to enlist whatever divine assistance may be available. There's a contemporary Mao altar in a home. It's hard to see it, but in the background there, carefully protected under cellophane, is a picture of the painting of Chairman Mao goes to Anyuan. The anthropologist Mo Bo-gao reports of his recent investigations in North China, quote, "Through all my travel and work in rural China, I've heard expressions of admiration, even love of Mao everywhere, but hardly any enthusiasm for Deng Xiaoping. Mao's portrait can still be seen in the average household, but one can hardly find a portrait of Deng in any peasant home." Now that the communist political system has lasted in China for a generation after the dismantling of the Soviet Union, the persistence of the polity that Mao and his comrades constructed perhaps is better explained in terms of the reconfiguration rather than simply the repudiation of a wide array of cultural resources, domestic and foreign alike. The Chinese Revolution was strongly influenced by the Russian paradigm, but I think it differed in its relationship to both elite and popular culture. A historian of the Soviet propaganda state, Peter Kennetz, stresses that the Bolsheviks were condescending and dismissive of their own traditions. As Kennetz puts it, quote, "Lenin and his fellow revolutionaries saw very little that was valuable in the indigenous culture of the Russian people." Similarly, Jeffrey Brooks, another historian, writes, quote, "Stalin and his circle were known to be contemptuous of peasants and peasant beliefs," unquote. By contrast, Mao, while every bit as radical and ruthless as his Russian counterparts, was nevertheless keenly attuned to the political power that was inherent in China's cultural traditions. As Mao enjoined his colleagues during the war with Japan, quote, "Our national history goes back thousands of years and has its own characteristics and its innumerable treasures. We should sum up our history from Confucius to Sun Yat-sen and take over this valuable legacy. Foreign stereotypes must be replaced by the fresh, lively Chinese style and spirit which the common people of China love," unquote. Mao and his comrades were erratic and they were eclectic in their mobilizing approach. But among their most important accomplishments was the reworking of cultural material, indigenous and foreign as well, to shape and solidify a new political order that owed a very great deal to the Soviets, and yet has come over time to be perceived by its own people as Chinese rather than as an alien implant. The construction of a powerful sense of nationalism was at the heart of this transformative project. So here you have a nationalist protest from this past fall, protesting Japan's claim over what Japan calls the Senkaku, or the Chinese, the Diaoyu Islands, and a portrait of Mao, and written at the bottom there is "Chairman Mao, we miss you." Or this one showing the amount of state control that's required to keep these nationalist protests in line. Mao's successors have continued to experiment with various forms of cultural patronage, attempting to direct public attention to older sources of national pride without, however, denying the legitimacy of Mao's revolution. They are not always successful in their efforts. Take, for instance, the statue of Confucius that was installed a couple of years ago in Tiananmen Square, right in front of the National Museum of History, which used to be known as the Museum of the Revolution, just to the side of Mao's mausoleum. The jarring sight of the ancient sage surrounded by monuments to the revolution generated enough of an outcry over the internet that the statue was quietly removed 3 months later. So, in conclusion, whether one admires or abhors Mao's revolution, it is, I think, too soon to write its obituary. To presume, as many people do, that the PRC survives only by virtue of an instrumental performance legitimacy that will dissipate just as soon as its sizzling economy begins to sputter is probably naive. The facility of Mao and a number of other communist leaders to introduce and adapt Soviet concepts in such a way as to render them culturally resonant shouldn't be overlooked in assessing either the establishment or the endurance of a communist political system in China. Important as economic stagnation was in hastening the fall of the former Soviet Union, it's not clear that an economic downturn would have the same effect in China. If, as this study of Anyuan has tried to suggest, Chinese communism draws its strength from somewhat deeper reservoirs than current GDP growth rates, then the longevity of its system is not necessarily well predicted by the lifespans of other communist regimes. Clever cultural governance has imbued China's leaders with a surprising degree of popular acceptance. But unraveling the Anyuan thread in the tapestry of Mao's revolution also, I think, lays bare one of the key contradictions and challenges facing contemporary China. On the one hand, we have seen a steady outpouring of cultural works that commemorate as well as critique the Anyuan revolutionary tradition, attesting to the persistent emotional power that the revolution still has in the Chinese political imaginary. But on the other hand, the glaring gap between the dismal plight of the actual Anyuan coal miners today as a century ago and the romanticized images that they have inspired speaks to the unfinished agenda of the Chinese Revolution. The demand for dignity by the dispossessed that was so poignantly captured by the watchword of the Anyuan strike, "Once we were beasts of burden, now we will be human," remains a central issue in Chinese political debate. And in the end, the survival of the Communist Party state may ultimately hinge upon its ability to satisfy this still unfulfilled promise of the Chinese revolutionary tradition. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for that really, truly fascinating presentation. It's really a pleasure to welcome Professor Perry to the New School, and also an honor to have the opportunity to comment upon her work. As my colleague Mark has reminded us, I approach Anyuan as a student of post-socialism and of the Soviet Union, and so my comments and questions will reflect this perspective. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I hope to keep this short in order to allow enough time for discussion. I'll raise two questions with the hope that they may together provide fodder for further discussion. My questions focus on the overarching analytical framework and comparative aspects of the book, and its implicit and explicit explanatory claims about revolutionary states, cultural positioning, and how we think about the resilience or rupture of political systems. So in my comments, I'll extend the parallel with Russia a bit further, and also ask what we might learn from different angles of comparison. Can everyone hear me? Okay. First, however, I'd like to take a moment to appreciate what this book, and indeed the entire Perry oeuvre, does not do. In Anyuan, the reader does not find a search for what Anna Krylova, writing on Western historiographies of Stalinism in the Soviet Union, calls, quote unquote, the tenacious liberal subject, the sustained, unreflexive, and binary effort in American academia and intellectual culture to uncover in communist man either, on the one hand, a credulous dupe, or, on the other, a projection of the resisting liberal self. Rather, Anyuan seeks to understand the uses of Chinese revolutionary tradition and the continuing appeal of revolutionary tropes, symbols, and practices on their own terms. And this is one of the really great and wonderful distinguishing features of this book. The first question I'd like to ask speaks to a broad set of issues in the study of politics having to do with the beginnings and ends of regimes. In the comparison with the Soviet Union that threads in and throughout the text, at sometimes surfacing in the story's weave and others resting in its weft, we are reminded of the resilience of the Chinese communist state relative to that of European and Eurasian state socialism. But when we speak of the durability, or, for that matter, the impermanence of a regime or political system, what precisely do we mean? Now, this is important, of course, because resilience and its relationship to cultural positioning is central to the framing of the uses of Anyuan. Are we referring to the persistence across time of a specific set of institutions? The reproduction of a single set of political elites or bureaucratic actors? The preservation of a specific territorial shape or name recognized by the international community? Or the continuous saturation of public discourse by a single coherent and static ideology? Or perhaps the preservation of a particular degree and type of state coordination of economic activity? Or the enduring presence of a particular worldview, set of cultural practices, or identities? Few political systems maintain stasis in all or even most of these characteristics over the longue durée. So if we consider this question from the point of view of people's experiences, what exactly does it mean to say that a political system endures or that it has collapsed? So depending on how we choose to answer this question and what definitional weight we choose to assign to different aspects of a given political system, we may see comparisons between Soviet and Chinese communist longevity in different light. I would suggest that in the context of such a comparison, reports of the death of Soviet power may have been greatly exaggerated, and that this contention may lead us toward different conclusions in the comparison of Soviet and Chinese resilience. The political technologists of Putin's Russia have recycled, reshaped, imitated, and reintroduced Soviet-era cultural and political resources, as well as institutional design, with genius, just as their Soviet-era counterparts, whatever their views of Russian culture, created syncretic political cultures out of pre-revolutionary Russian and revolutionary religious, artistic, and legal elements. This cultural positioning suggests legitimacy, obtains compliance, and even generates a certain type of social cohesion. Now, this is to say that the absence of the Soviet state does not, as such, does not mean necessarily that the system is dead and buried. Rather, to a certain extent, if we view Russian politics through the lens of many ordinary people's experiences, we see continuities between the late Soviet period, particularly the 1970s and early 1980s, and today that make the event known as the fall of communism look a lot more like Philip Morris's reinvention as altria and a lot less like democratic revolution. There was a Russian vernacular expression popular in the 1990s to express this idea and the behavior of post-Soviet elites and institutions. Те же яйца, только в профиль. The same eggs, just seen from the other side. Eggs, of course, don't have a side. So, now, I'd like to note that in using the Russian case to suggest we disaggregate analysis of political systems to think about continuity and rupture, and about the ways that states are successful or not at persisting in their being, I'm not saying that nothing has changed since the fall of communism, nor am I making the invidious comparison between Vladimir Putin and Joseph Stalin that we hear in certain corners of American public discourse. Rather, I'm suggesting that in comparing the trajectories and fates of revolutionary states, we not take for granted that apparent resilience does not hide incipient rupture, or that apparent failure does not preclude persistence in a different form. My second, briefer question lies to a certain extent outside the scope of this book, but I could not help wondering what role contemporary market forces and societal reactions to them are playing in this story of regime resilience. If the uncertainty and risk precipitated by rapid market and thus cultural transformation is, as Polanyi and others would lead us to expect, leading people to react by embracing local and national cultures, then the Chinese Communist Party and revolutionary culture would seem to be a logical site of resistance, though there's that pesky liberal subject rearing its head again, or a safe harbor of Chineseness. So in this sense, we might ask, what work is the market doing to make the party seem Chinese? Here, too, the parallel with Russia might be extended to consider how evocations of past identities associated with the communist period are being used to mobilize national sentiment and to generate regime legitimacy. So in closing, I'd like to suggest that useful comparisons may be found in thinking not only in terms of the relative and temporally inscribed resilience of regimes in Russia and China, but also in the content of the contemporary legitimizing narratives in these two states and their relationship to shifts in different components of what we call political systems. In particular, if we turn our attention in both cases to the contemporary use of native symbols and practices in cultivating popular attention and affection for revolutionary legacies, we may see different planes of similarity and difference, planes that together may shed better light on understanding more about politics in the rest of the world. Thanks.
Would you like to respond first to some of Jessica's remarks?
Sure. Thank you very much for those thoughtful comments, Jessica. I certainly agree entirely with your suggestion that apparent resilience may in fact hide incipient rupture, and I hazard no predictions about the future endurance of the Chinese communist system. And I also, of course, accept your point that in many ways what we see in contemporary Russia is reminiscent of what was there in the Soviet Union. And yet the USSR as a political system, I think we would agree, no longer exists, even if contemporary Russia is influenced in many very powerful ways by its earlier communist experience. I think no political system can have decades of a communist political system without being deeply influenced by it, and Russia, having been at the heart of the former Soviet Union, certainly was. But it seems to me that the Soviet Union was in a very difficult position because with the fact that so many individuals did not identify ethnically as Russian, but identified as other ethnicities, it made it constantly very difficult to put forward a new culture after 1917. You couldn't have it be just a Russian culture, because what about the Ukrainians and so forth? On the other hand, if you have it as a Soviet culture, that does not have, it seems to me, the same kind of emotional resonance that the Chinese have been able to draw on by now proclaiming that theirs is a Chinese culture. And I think China faces enormous difficulty in places at the peripheries of its empire. I don't think these kinds of cultural claims work very well well in places like Tibet and Xinjiang. But I think the fact that in China, about 95% of the population, at least, has an identity as Han. I mean, I'm not saying this is an unproblematic identity. Obviously, there are Sichuanese and Shanghainese and so forth. But nevertheless, the idea of Zhonghua, of China, is something that about 95% of those living within China identify with. And I think that gives a very powerful advantage to the Chinese communist system on identifying a communist culture that's at the same time a Chinese culture that was much more problematic for the former Soviet Union. Not that elements of the Soviet cultural project don't continue in Russia. I think they very much do. I also think that market forces are a very important and contradictory force in all of this. One of the things that has certainly changed in the post-Mao period is a much more open market for cultural products. And in fact, much of the Mao nostalgia one can see through the market, with people buying trinkets and using them as kind of charms in automobiles and so forth. The Red Tourism campaign, I think, was a very clever effort on the part of the Chinese state, in essence, to use the market for patriotic purposes. So to get people to spend their tourist dollars by going to places like Anyuan, and they spend their tourist dollars, hopefully raise the economic standards in what still remains some of the poorest parts of China, and at the same time get back in touch with their revolutionary roots by doing this. So I think there are lots of clever ways in which the Chinese state is using the market for purposes that are quite compatible with its own project, although this is certainly not a seamless or unconflictual ground. And over the internet and through many other means, there are all kinds of alternative and challenging cultural signals and symbols that people can appropriate. So I don't mean to suggest that it's a simple or uncomplicated cultural terrain.
Okay, I'll let Professor Perry take questions from the floor. We do have a roaming mic that we appreciate your using. It's going to be roaming here in just a second. So.
Oh, why don't you call on them, and I'll.
Okay. Yes. First, Xiaobo, Lu. Yeah. Here we've got it. Yeah, we're recording. So yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Liz, really great to see you here. I want to bring us back from the sort of the contemporary to the back to the origin, to the culture positioning that you were so well presented. Looking at the image and hearing your case of Anyuan, I couldn't help to think that there are two major. I think this is your argument. Two major kind of cultural positioning happen there. One is the use of religious symbols, the deities and so on. The other is triad, sort of, also the sort of a traditional institution, if you will. That I wonder that being in sort of a South Central China, where this kind of a local sort of tradition is quite uniquely different from, say, where I'm from, Northern China. You study in your early career of Northern Chinese Revolution. So comparing this to regional, I mean, I couldn't see that, triad wasn't active in Northern China, nor sort of a local religion not as strong, certainly in terms of clan, that kind of local clan it's not as strong as in the South. And we do see that in the past 30 years of the study of China, study especially rural area, you see that contrast. So I wonder if same thing could happen, say, in Kailuan mine. Would that be possible? Mm-hmm. So that culture positioning in the north, what would we imagine be the same, or what would be like then there?
You
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I will say, if you go further south still, let me begin there, and look at Peng Pai. I think he used very similar techniques in Hailufeng to what Li Lisan used at Anyuan. He was dealing with peasants. The real beginning of the Rural Revolution is there in Guangdong, and you see Peng Pai using all varieties of local religion, and he was known as Bodhisattva Peng and was worshipped. But Li Lisan was very creative. I mean, I would say it was fortuitous in that he came from that local area, and so he was tuned in to what the traditions of that local area were. You're quite correct, the triads were not influential in the north, but of course in the north you had White Lotus, secret society, various other kinds of things that you could feed into if you had leaders in that area who were as savvy about it. Li Lisan, it seems to me, used all kinds of things. So he used, on the one hand, these triad secret society conventions. He used religious festivals. But he also used, for example, he had some kind of large metal badge that he had apparently picked up when he was in France. I have no idea what it was. I can't find in the sources. But he liked to wear this big metal badge, and the workers would look at it and say, oh, that's the badge that makes him invulnerable to bullets. And he did nothing to dispel that idea that he was invulnerable to bullets when he wore that badge. And when the warlords brought in their troops to fight against him, this rumor went among the troops, too, that they couldn't go up against Li Lisan. And again, he was quite happy to rely on that. So I think he used a whole variety of folk cultures and foreign as well as local sources of power, weaving them together very cleverly. And the religious traditions, the secret society traditions in different parts of China certainly are very different. But Li Lisan, when he left Anyuan, went first to Wuhan, and then he went to Shanghai, which in many ways is very, very different from Anyuan, but in other ways is similar in that it is an immigrant society of workers there. And Li Lisan said that when he went to Shanghai, he took two lessons from Anyuan. One was that you had to work with the local elite. You had to figure out what the power of the local elite was, and you had to somehow manage to get to them. Now, this was pretty easy for him to do in Anyuan because his father had all these connections there. His father was a good friend with the head of the local Chamber of Commerce, and he used that and so forth. When he went to Shanghai, he had none of those things, but when he went to Shanghai, he also found out who the head of the Chamber of Commerce was and brought him on board for the May 30th movement. One of the first things he did when he went to Shanghai was find out who the Red Gang leader was there. Now, again, the Hongbang and the Qingbang, very, very different. Different origins, different traditions, different rituals, and so on. But in Shanghai, Li Lisan joined the Green Gang, pledged allegiance to one of the top Green Gang leaders, and after he did that, managed to recruit workers in the tobacco factories and the textile mills and so on. So I think, it was easier for him at Anyuan, not only because the local traditions maybe were more religious and he came from that area, but simply that he knew it better. But on the other hand, he felt that these were modular tactics that could be taken elsewhere. And I think we do see that. When I was working, as you mentioned, my earlier work was on North China, the North China countryside, and I did argue in my dissertation that there was in many ways a real clash between the peasant culture and the tradition of peasant rebellion in that area and the communist revolution when they moved in. But at the same time, I recorded in that book that Liu Shaoqi and others, when they were actively trying to organize in the north, and they heard rumors that the peasants were saying that Zhu De, the head of the Red Army, was a descendant of Zhu Yuanzhang, the head of the Ming dynasty, and that he was going going to put the Ming back on the throne, and that he was a kind of millenarian leader, which had been the prophecy of the White Lotus secret society in these areas in China. And Liu Shaoqi and others pointed out, well, this has been very helpful to our mobilizing efforts, and there's no need to disabuse peasants of the notion that Juda is somehow related to Zhu Yuanzhang. We can deal with that later on. So I think there was at least the effort to apply these same approaches, but it did have to differ in different parts of China depending on what the local religious and other kinds of beliefs were.
Carl, and then in the back, Carl Minsner. Please introduce yourself.
Sure. Carl Minsner, Fordham Law School. Thank you very much. I love your presentation. Particularly like the way you draw the strands, the historical strands, all the way from the 20s all the way up to the present. I was just going to push you a little bit to maybe even take it all the way up to the very present. If I remember correctly, the National History Museum reopened in China within the last year or two. They did sort of a major renovation of the depiction of Chinese history. And in fact, Xi Jinping, one of his first official actions after assuming Politburo Standing membership was to take the entire Politburo Standing Committee to go see collectively the new depiction of Chinese history. What's the depiction of Anyuan in that exhibit, and what does it tell us about the direction that Chinese leaders may be seeking to sort of take the revolutionary tradition going forward?
I'm sorry to say I don't know exactly what's in that exhibit. I do know it's entitled The Revival of the Chinese Nation, which was also a major theme both in the outgoing party secretary, Hu Jintao, and in the incoming party secretary, Xi Jinping's speeches at the party congress. Hu Jintao, the outgoing party secretary, pronounced that culture is the lifeblood of the nation, and we must have a revival of the Chinese nation. And Xi Jinping, then standing in front of this monumental painting of the Great Wall, re-echoed that, or echoed rather, that the Communist Party is the inheritor of 5,000 years of Chinese tradition, and our mission is to revive the Chinese nation. And then, as you said, took the members of the Standing Committee to see this exhibit. And I don't know if Anyuan plays a role there. I've talked to several people who have seen the exhibit, but who've only told me that it is very much standard party historiography, and the party and Mao are certainly depicted as having allowed China to stand tall again in the international world after the humiliation of the Opium Wars. So I think it begins in the 19th century with the Opium Wars, and then things look pretty grim until 1921, and suddenly they look a lot better, and the Communist Party comes along, and people reunify and so forth. But I don't actually know how Anyuan is depicted in that. But yes, the whole Xi Jinping's idea of a Chinese dream, I think, is really very interesting too. To my knowledge, he hasn't given any real content to that dream, but presumably it's supposed to be, China's equivalent to an American dream, which keeps us going. But, our American dream, I guess, is for each of us to have our own house and our own car. And I presume that the Chinese dream is a collective dream for the nation to be strong vis-a-vis other nations in the world and never to be humiliated again as it was in the Opium Wars and the Sino-Japanese War, and with the Chinese Communist Party in charge, presumably it won't be. So my guess is that he will flesh that out in the future, and that we'll have that collective rather than an individual and nationalistic more than materialistic dimension. But I think we don't really know that yet.
Yes, and Lily?
Hi, Lily Ling, New School. I really enjoyed your talk. It seems to reinforce a standing observation in those who study China that it's precisely this kind of very detailed cultural work that led the CCP to triumph over the nationalists, because they did not do this kind of detailed cultural work. They focused too much on getting foreign aid, particularly from the U.S., and they've set themselves up as a model of Westernization, modernization, and lost touch with the people. But isn't it an irony, historical irony, that today's China is moving towards that kind of nationalist self-image, and that this Anyuan history may be seen as anachronistic or archaic, out of touch with today's China, and in fact the nationalist vision for China may in fact be ironically more apropos for the China dream, the Chinese dream that Xi Jinping was talking about.
So by the nationalist vision, you mean seeking legitimacy in the kind of 5,000 years of Chinese culture and Confucian?
Not necessarily. I mean, it's more in terms of the kind of contemporary consumerist capitalist market-based understanding of contemporary China.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are so many ironies in all of this. No small irony in the fact that there is now a relatively close relationship, again, between the KMT and the CCP, with the DPP being the odd man out, if you will, and the DPP arguing that, on Taiwan there's also Polynesian culture and various other things, and that Taiwan shouldn't just see itself as part of Chinese national culture. I do think that it may well be that at some future point, the Anyuan revolutionary tradition and other milestones of the communist revolution come to be forgotten. But I don't think it will be as long as there is a communist party in power in China. It seems to me that the Communist Party, although increasingly it is relying on a nationalistic argument, and it is drawing for its legitimacy, if you want to call it that, on all kinds of earlier tropes in China and trying to suggest that there's a seamless kind of transition from the past to the present, that nevertheless it cannot easily deny the role of Mao or the role of the revolution, because otherwise there is really no need to have a Communist Party there. And why is Xi Jinping in power now? In large part because he is the son of a revolutionary. And why are so many of those other members of the Standing Committee there? Because they also have ties that go back, so that they are a kind of communist aristocracy. And what legitimates them really is the revolution and the Communist Party. And I think Deng Xiaoping was very clever in the 1980s in pulling the plug on the de-Maoification that was underway at that time. In the 1980s really is a fascinating time, and for those of us who spend a lot of time living and teaching and learning in China at that time, I often feel nostalgic for the 1980s, when it seemed as though anything was possible and anything might happen. That was the time when you had the movie Heshang, the River Elegy, which was highly critical of Chinese tradition and suggested that the Confucian tradition was a kind of dead end, and China should get in touch with its May 4th tradition instead and open up to the rest of the world. It was a time when all kinds of different critical forces were at play. But I think for the purposes of the Chinese Communist Party's maintaining its power, Deng Xiaoping made a very smart move in the midst of all this very dynamic cultural discussion to clamp down on the efforts toward de-Maoification that were underway within the party itself. And had China gone that way, I think it would have had the same sorts of issues that the former Soviet Union faced. And that Deng Xiaoping was very conscious of what de-Stalinization had meant in the Soviet Union. And in the reading of the official Chinese Communist verdict on what happened in the Soviet Union, you know, they definitely trace it back to Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956. And for them, you know, that's the beginning of the end, when you say that one of the major leaders around whom there was a cult of personality needs to be denounced, then this opens the door for everything to be questioned. And Deng Xiaoping prevented that. And I think, you know, since then, the Chinese Communist Party, and then particularly after 1989, when it made a concerted effort to carry out patriotic education campaign, and to insist on an identity of nationalism that could go back thousands of years in Chinese culture, but that had to be identified with the revolution, that it was the revolution that rescued this wonderful tradition. I mean, it's very ironic, obviously, in that the Cultural Revolution in many ways was a frontal attack on that tradition, with attacking the four olds and so forth. And Xi Jinping, behind closed doors, will say, you know, we're a Soviet system. Unless we deal with corruption, we will face the same end that the Soviet Union came to. It came apart because its institutions were corrupt and so forth, and we have to reform ourselves. We're basically a communist, Leninist, socialist system. But you'll never hear him saying that in public. In public, we are a Chinese system, and we have all kinds of problems like Chinese systems have always have. We have nepotism, we have corruption, we have bureaucratism, we have feudal remnants, and so forth. And that, I believe, is the discourse that is popularly accepted within China. And I think it's a discourse that was made possible by Deng Xiaoping's clever effort to talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics. So that increasingly people in China can be very, very critical of the regime, but almost never will you hear somebody criticizing the regime as being un-Chinese, as being an import from the Soviet Union. Instead, it's just too Chinese. That's usually the criticism that's waged against it, that culturally it's so Chinese, and that we need some kinds of restrictions. We have rule of man instead of rule of law. That's very Chinese, and so forth. And that, I believe, is the real achievement of the Chinese Communist propaganda and cultural apparatus.
Okay, in the back here. Oh, all right, then here. Yes.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. It was particularly interesting. I work with the UN NGO community on Interfaith Good Government Institute. And it seems peculiar to me that we still use, what does the word communism mean today for Chinese communism, when the idea of equality, and there's so much inequality there, as well as you brought up some very good points, the idea of guerrilla warfare, some of the things that are going on today, the use of proxy states, not just North Korea, and not just my opinion, or it's debatable today, but the competitive politics and nationalism, and there's a book, Nations, you're familiar with Why Nations Fail, Robinson, etc.
Yeah, they're my colleagues.
Oh, they're very good. Yeah, exactly. And the issue of adaptation, which you brought up particularly well, and the need to continue to adapt to a different politics, and then economics is not just a mathematical thing, but the importance of politics and adaptation. And how can we evolve to a more, after the fall of communism, when I got involved in these things, how can we evolve to what Kissinger and et cetera was saying, to a more human rights, respectful, human dignity orientation?
Well, I would agree with you that the use of the term communism toward China is, the reason I use that is to point, I only use it in speaking of its political system, not certainly of its economic system these days, although of course the state retains a very strong hand in the economy, but the market has become very powerful in contemporary China, so it's no longer a command demand economy of the sort that it was during the Maoist era. And culturally as well. There is so much greater pluralism these days, all kinds of cultural influences, much less controlled by the party than it once was. But still, institutionally, it remains a Leninist party system in which the Communist Party, through its nomenclatura personnel appointment system, retains control over the players at all levels of the system. And that, I think, is very important, and we sometimes tend to forget about that. At the same time, the Communist Party membership has changed dramatically in the post-Mao period. So at the beginning of the Mao period, right after the victory of the revolution, the party was heavily peasant in its composition. These days, one of the extraordinary things that Jiang Zemin did when he was party secretary was to articulate this conception of the three represents, which everyone chuckles about in China, but nevertheless had a revolutionary impact on the composition of the Communist Party because it legitimized the recruitment of capitalists into the Communist Party. And so the Communist Party actively goes out and co-opts entrepreneurs, innovative marketeers and so on into the Communist Party so that the winners of reform are within the party instead of outside the party. So in terms of its personnel, it's now a highly educated party. It's quite a wealthy party with a large percentage of entrepreneurs who comprise it. And yet institutionally, in terms of the way it operates, it's still party secretaries who are in control, and they are put in their positions through higher level appointment in this Leninist party system. And so, that's what I mean by using the term communist. But it's also a very adaptive system. It has been from the early period. And I do believe that one of the important differences between Chinese and Soviet communism, and this is the argument that Sebastian Heilmann and I make in that volume, Mao's Invisible Hand, is that during the war with Japan in particular, in the wartime base areas in China, the Chinese communists, in order to survive, had to be extremely flexible, fast on their feet, adaptive in terms of all kinds of policies. And they developed a variety of experimentation, a kind of trial by error of experimental points, or what are known in shidian in Chinese, that became very important in the PRC as well, and that this kind of trial and error was something that was developed over the long 30-year history of the revolution. As Xiaobo mentioned, it moved from the south up to the north. It had to adapt to entirely different environments from one part of China to another, urban to rural, and then South China to North China. And in the course of doing that, developed a number of different policies and approaches. And we call it Mao's invisible hand by arguing that it's not just the magic of the market that explains China's phenomenal economic success in recent years. We believe it also has something to do with this very ingenious policy mechanism within the Chinese Communist Party that we believe is quite distinctive. It certainly has some similarities in other communist systems elsewhere, but we believe that the way in which it developed in China and the role that it plays in contemporary policy making is quite distinctive and is a very important part of the success story, but has created this paradox in which you have what is still institutionally a largely unreformed communist political system, even though the content of it, the composition of it is quite different from what it was previously, and the policies of it and the economics of it are very, very different from what it was previously. But this is something that really no one predicted 30 years ago. You know, as with the death of Mao, people generally predicted, well, China might limp along with its current communist system, but if it does so, its economy will be a disaster, or it could scrap its communist system and have a booming economy. But the idea that you could have sustained double-digit economic growth for almost 30 years running, the fastest economic transformation world history has ever seen, presided over by a communist institutional system, was something that people did not foresee. And it seems to me does require some understanding of the very distinctive route that the Chinese communists took to get there, and that equipped them with resources that were quite different from those of other communist systems. The closest to them are the others that also went through protracted rural revolutions, like Vietnam, like Laos, like North Korea, like Cuba. They remain communist systems. They all had rural revolutions, and they all have a kind of nationalist identity that's very closely associated with their revolutionary route to power. They were generally not as long-lived as the Chinese Revolution, but nevertheless, I believe that those origins imbued a kind of legitimacy on their parties that certainly those where communism was imposed by Soviet tanks after the Second World War, like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere, where leaders were often seen as Soviet agents rather than nationalist leaders. That's very different from a Ho Chi Minh or a Mao Zedong or a Fidel Castro.
Would you say human dignity is associated with group power, nationalist power, as opposed to human rights in current China?
I feel that there's not the emphasis on human dignity that I believe that revolutionary tradition ought to be encouraging in China, to be quite honest. You know, one of the reasons that I was inclined to write this book was when I visited Cuba a while ago, and it really was quite striking to me when you see signs of the revolution everywhere, banners everywhere about the revolution, Museum of the Revolution filled with symbols of the revolution, people talking about it constantly. And when I asked people, you know, so what is the Cuban revolutionary tradition, I got a virtually consistent answer from almost everyone. The Cuban Revolution is two things. It's universal and free health care and universal and free education. You know, in the United States, you can ask almost anyone, and people will generally say, okay, the revolutionary tradition is freedom. It's freedom of religion, it's freedom of association, and so on. The American Revolution is about freedom from British domination. In China, I've asked this question to many, many people, and usually I get an embarrassed laughter, and people say, our revolutionary tradition, I don't know, people talk about it all the time, I don't have a clue what it is. Or if they do hazard an answer, it will usually be something negative. It will be, it's class struggle. That's what our revolutionary tradition is, and we ought to get rid of it. And so part of my interest in going back and looking at the early years of the revolution was trying to understand what had inspired people to sacrifice so much at that early period. And in looking at the Anyuan revolutionary tradition, I was very struck with how the appeal there was very much on the basis of human dignity. And it is an appeal that you find in Chinese peasant rebellions, but those peasant rebellions didn't set up schools to actually provide literacy for workers and workers' clubs to provide new forms of culture for them and so forth. And so, you know, I thought it was quite instructional to go back to that early period and see how the mobilization operated there and the appeals that were being raised. But I myself don't feel that either the Communist Party or ordinary people in China have a very clear idea of what their revolutionary tradition consists of. And my feeling is that that is actually dangerous for a revolutionary society, because I think, any revolutionary society has a lot of unpleasant things that one would rather forget and one wish were not part of one's revolutionary heritage. And yet the fact is that if a nation is born in revolution, and especially a revolution as wrenching as a Chinese revolution that led to such enormous sacrifice and loss of life, that not coming to terms with it and figuring out some usable history on the basis of which you can proudly move forward, to me is actually very dangerous. And that's why I think you get things like the Cultural Revolution, where you can have a particular interpretation of the revolutionary history that many people in China feel was a very misguided and very destructive interpretation of their revolutionary history. But I think until there is a positive interpretation that not everyone has to agree upon, but that there is some kind of national consensus on it in a positive way in which people can move forward, that it will remain a real problem for Chinese political discourse.
And final question here, I think, is that Joshua? Yeah.
Well, I hope it doesn't take us too far abroad for our final question. It's actually wonderful you mentioned Cuba, because this is the question I had in mind, and this is about Mao's influence abroad. So I work on Latin American political thought, and what strikes me is that in the Latin American Marxist tradition, there's this move as well to attempt to link socialism or Marxism to pre-existing traditions, or to adapt the kind of revolutionary strategy to the circumstances that exist in these countries. And what's interesting is that these theorists that are doing this in the 50s and 60s in Latin America take themselves to be doing something that they call Maoism at times, when they talk about guerrilla warfare, peasant leadership of the Marxist revolution, even at times incorporation of, say, Incan traditions or an ideal of Incan communism. So my question is, do you have any sense of how this sort of syncretic quality of Mao's revolution has influenced its influence abroad, and has it made it actually easier for it to be taken up in these other revolutionary centers?
I didn't hear quite the end of it. How that's made it easier to be absorbed by other. It's not something that I really have worked on, so I'm very interested in your comments on this. Recently I was on the dissertation committee of a historian, just completed his dissertation at Northeastern University in Boston, did a really interesting dissertation on the Cultural Revolution, the way in which it was received internationally, but also the importance of the way in which it was being received back in China itself. So we often, studying China in that period, think of China as sort of closing itself off, criticizing the Soviet Union and going its own way and so on. But as this dissertation points out, the Chinese Communist Party was very carefully monitoring the reception of Maoism in all these different places, extremely sensitive to how positively it was or wasn't being taken, and at the same time when foreigners came and visited China, making sure that their views were recorded very carefully, and hoping that there were all kinds of things that were very supportive of Maoism there. But actually, most of my understanding of the influence of Maoism abroad has been on student movements in the 1960s, partly due to autobiographical reasons. And, most of us around my age who are in Chinese studies in this country were very influenced by Maoism as students engaged in the anti-war protest in this country. And it amuses me when I'm in China and lecturing on social movements and so forth, I'll often show a picture of the Black Panthers in Oakland, holding up their little red books, and I'll ask them, so these are the Black Panthers in Oakland in 1968. What do you think they're holding there? And not once have I had someone in China say it was Mao's little red book. Is it the Bible? that they're holding? No, it's not the Bible. The Koran? No. So, you know, the lack of awareness in China that Mao's Little Red Book could have had a profound impact on the Black Power movement in this country, on a whole generation of students engaged in the anti-war movement and so forth. So, you know, I do think that that is a very interesting issue of the transnational impact of Maoism. It's something that Alex Cook at Berkeley has also been very interested in, the history of the Little Red Book as it traveled around. But to tell you honestly, I hadn't really thought about how the syncretic qualities of Maoism might have traveled to other places. Most of those who I've read who were influenced by Mao's ideas are people like Marcuse and George Lukács and Sartre and so forth, who were impressed by the voluntaristic quality of Maoism and the malleability of consciousness and so forth, but not so much by the syncretic or the folk culture aspects of it. So it's an interesting statement for me to think about.
Okay, I want to thank you. I want to thank Professor Perry and Professor Pisano for her comments.